On the 27th of October 2005, the police are called to investigate a reported break-in on a construction site. To avoid interrogation, 3 teenagers hid in an electricity substation. 2 of them died of electrocution, Siad Bena and Bouna Traoré. Riots broke out during the night in Clichy-sous-Bois. In the following night, it will spread to the rest of northern Paris and other banlieues throughout France. A common metric is the number of burned cars, of which a certain number can be attributed to protests. We can see here the spread over France. The total number reached a peak on the 7th of November and will fade out to be almost back to normal on the 17th, after 3 weeks of uninterrupted violence and tension. This series of riots is unheard of in terms of length, number of municipalities concerned, and arrestations. In Western countries, only the civil rights movement in the US is comparable. Many factors add to the death of the 2 teenagers to explain such a spontaneous revolt. Police violence, mainly through abusive identity checks, arrestations, and verbal abuse. Lack of funding for initiatives to integrate young people. Defiance from politicians who defend the police and openly challenge protesters.
Vous en avez assez, hein? Vous avez assez de cette bande de racailles. On va vous en débarrasser.
C'est que je n'ai pas l'intention de dialoguer pour rétablir l'ordre.
But this is not the first, nor the last, riot France has seen since the 80s, and the incredible strength and broadness of this one shows a deeper problem in the peripheries. When listening to the voices of protesters, or simply looking at those suburbs, the disconnect between those areas and the rest of France is striking. How did this state of exclusion come about? Why do protesters resort to violence so often? In the second part of the 19th century, the Haussmannian model defined a vision of a modern city against pollution, overcrowding, and unsanitary poor neighborhoods that characterize Paris and many French cities. In contrast, Haussmann's city has large avenues, air, light, modern and standardized buildings. Meanwhile, the suburbs are meant for the large new factories. Production is progressively removed from inner Paris. This phenomenon is echoed throughout France. The suburbs where workers live will face a massive influx of new inhabitants in the middle of the 20th century due to related factors. The baby boom, an increase in natality associated with less death with the end of the war and medical progress. Industrial growth draws many people from the rural areas, a process called rural exodus. Immigration from French colonies and Africa to rebuild France and work in factories. The suburbs became overcrowded and unsanitary. Many slums developed. The living conditions were still comparable to those of the beginning of the 20th century, but the advances and riches of that time of growth made this situation intolerable and urgent. Thanks to political mobilization between 1953 and 1975, the number of homes went from 12.7 million to 21 million. Social housing went from 500,000 units to 3 million units. 1/3 of which in the form of grands ensembles. Due to this great haste, only housing units are built without any basic services, vaguely inspired by modernist principles. A landscape of uniform concrete buildings, construction is standardized and efficient, the units are functional and similar, decision-making was highly centralized without any public involvement. This scale of modern housing construction is unmatched in Western countries. Such projects were only undertook in the USSR.
Vous vous ennuyez ou pas?
Oh, beaucoup, oui. Beaucoup, on a le flipper, puis c'est tout, on n'a rien à faire.
Strong criticism will emerge in the 60s and shed light on the sickness of the grands ensembles. Boredom, criminality and suicide will affect young people and women. There is little sense of community and identity in those areas. The development will stop in the middle of the 70s as a response, and the state's endeavor will be directed instead onto locally planned sprawling neighborhoods for the middle class. Meanwhile, immigrants still lived in slums, so a series of policies to better integrate them will facilitate their accession to such housing. The grands ensembles will concentrate the immigrant population, whose livelihood will only deteriorate due to desindustrialization and poor maintenance. Overcrowding does not help. More than 5 million people live there, generally in large families. Unemployment of young people is extremely high. Drug trafficking is ubiquitous. Dwellers lost both the factories the neighborhood were built for, but also the traditional self-governance and the education of the workers' communities, a void later filled by policemen and schools. This history of the banlieue reveals an important shift in the specialization of inequalities and domination. It went from the factories to the post-industrial city as a space for integration and participation. However, inhabitants of those suburbs are not represented politically by unions, politicians and institutions like workers were before. Instead, they are excluded and concentrated in dilapidated peripheries. This exclusion is acute in a contrast between peripheries and the urban civic square that stands for equality and sovereignty. People from the periphery contest this segregation and inequalities. They are reminded of the lack of substantive citizenship by judicial, political and cultural powers.
30 ans qu'on a cette carte-là et franchement on est mis de côté quoi. Et on en a marre.
Toujours nous relancer sur des fils d'immigrés, alors que nous on est tous nés ici. Et la plupart on connaît plus ici que nos pays d'origine.
Madame, Monsieur, bonsoir. Scène d'émeute et de pillage à Vaux-en-Velin, une cité dortoir près de Lyon, après la mort controversée d'un jeune motard hier après-midi. Après le drame, les jeunes du quartier s'en sont pris aux forces de l'ordre et la tension n'a fait que croître au fil des heures. Affrontements violents, centre commercial incendié, 7 pompiers blessés et plusieurs journalistes molestés, leur matériel détruit. Récit Claude.
Violence rose in the 70s, but the public fully realized the extent of the problem in the summer of '81. However, the dire situation of the inhabitants shocked the public the most. It triggered the expansion of the state's urban policies, politique de la ville. Nonetheless, urban violence became widespread in the following years as disindustrialization proceeded and the post-war boom seemed more and more distant. Unemployment and police brutality only continued to increase. In the term urban violence, journalists and politicians group together a whole spectrum of actions and define it as deviancy against social order, thus emptying the meaning of such riots. Right-wing politicians, intellectuals and journalists usually frame those as uncontrolled entertainment for mindless barbarians. The inhabitants of those ghettos are responsible for their poor situation, thus adopting a more guilt-inducing discourse. As a result, they call for strict and violent repression to face this apparently nonsensical violence. On the other hand, left-wing intellectuals paint the riots as a mechanical consequence of the state of despair due to exogenous factors in which locals are passive and victims. In both instances, protesters are robbed of their protest. Others instrumentalize the events to advance their own ideas. Historically, a riot is a primitive act of revolt, as the institutions cannot or do not want to integrate the claims, often made without a clear program and leaders. Before trade unions, workers systematically resorted to riots, for example. Hip-hop artists are among the most vocal critics of this situation. However, the place of hip-hop music itself is a crucial instance of relative exclusion from both the cultural sphere and the public realm in general. The sudden entrance of hip-hop into mainstream media is due to the riots of the late 20th century. Journalists and the public knew nothing of the Grands Ensembles, so inviting artists was instrumental in covering experiences and demands of rioters. Artists were welcomed and hailed as the voices of the Grands Ensembles, but the most radical were deemed too critical and judgmental for audiences, and their interventions on main media outlets were gradually limited. Instead, consensual artists would be promoted, culminating in the 2000s. Their texts naively push for peaceful reconciliation, perfectly in tune with the political discourse. the more radical artists are sometimes sued without much success. However, it came to a head after the 2005 riots, when 201 right-wing representatives put forward a motion to ban incendiary songs. Hip-hop artists allegedly provoked violence with their brutal imagery and hate of France. Rappers should be glad to live in France rather than in the countries their ancestors came from, so they have little right to denounce their condition. Colonial history of France isn't important.
Ce que le cinéma se permet, la télé, les livres et les magazines, pour nous c'est prohibé.
Hip-hop culture is central to forge the identity of this youth, as they share interest in graffiti, music and dance. This culture is a resistance identity to reclaim means of artistic expression. Rarely directly political, they express a desire to be respected, recognized both as artists and French citizens. A recurring idea is that they represent where they come from in both senses of the word, as they create an artistic depiction of the environment and speak for those who cannot. So, at the core of hip-hop history and message, we find the spatial and social exclusion of the grands ensembles. In this context, rap songs are cries for help rather than war cries. They call for mediation and exchange. Artists internalize many values of the French Republic, namely democracy, equality, individual success and performance. In this sense, rap and riots both stand for a call to be seen, recognized and respected, a claim absent in older popular protests. This demand is specific to contemporary capitalist France, where individual citizenship seemingly replaced classes and castes of the past. However, their message is not echoed in the political sphere, all the opposite, because it is perceived as against France and its great institutions. Militant hip-hop is marginalized.
Vous nous traitez comme des moins que rien sur vos chaînes publiques et vous attendez de nous qu'on s'écrive vive la République. Mon respect se fait violer au pays des droits de l'homme. Difficile de se sentir français sur le syndrome de Stockholm parce que moi je...
As a result, even one of the most peaceful forms of protest is brushed off, thus leading to more entrenchment and more conflict. Hip-hop as an example shows how public discourse often fails to integrate claims of those minorities. French riots are therefore a result of a social-spatial ghettoization of the suburbs, a mismanagement of state services, an inability to protest through peaceful and organized means, a faith in the Republic and its institutions makes any demand inaudible. Then, violent protest is the only rational course of action, and as violence is discredited as too radical, it can only escalate. Riots are ambivalent. They are both infra-political, in the sense that protesters simultaneously depend on and cannot access the political system, so they resort to violence, but also supra-political, as they press for general rights of the citizen to escape the emptiness of the ghetto, based on moral values. Both aspects characterize the rudimentary nature of protests that is seemingly inescapable. The establishment perpetuates this situation. After the 2005 riots, the Grands Ensembles will see a momentous renovation plan, with 48 billion euros invested over 15 years. Nonetheless, economic conditions did not improve one bit, poverty only increased, unemployment is extremely high, close to 45% for young people, twice as much as in the rest of France. The rare attempts to create equal opportunities were undercut by the changes in presidency or government. The fracture between the police and the population only increased. The good management of the crisis by the police encouraged continued militarization and centralization of the police, rather than focusing on proximity and trust. In terms of perception, the public grew more wary of sensitive peripheries, and the media coverage, years later, still adopt the perspective of the police. Many initiatives were created to give a voice to people of the Grands Ensembles, through existing or new media, associations or artistic projects, but their impact has been limited so far. Recently, many momentous social movements carried similar demands, with better organization and political representation, mainly Nuit Debout, Gilets jaunes protests, and Black Lives Matter demonstration. Starting in the US, it was quickly echoed in France, showing that the fight against systemic oppression and racism of society's periphery is still highly topical.